So, guys, I want to talk about the passing of Hulk Hogan just one more time because I had a couple of days to think about it and really think about his impact and whether or not he was a good person or a bad person. And I do want to say that with professional wrestling, it really it really turned into a major industry because of two people. Number one, Vince McMahon, and then the second person is Hulk Hogan. And if you want to talk about a third person, you have to put The Rock or Triple H because Triple H is in charge of WWE. He is the post Vince era, and that has a huge impact. Um, but then you also put The Rock on it for introducing people to Hollywood, and then you can even argue that you put the Young Bucks on it as well because definitely AEW has had a huge impact on professional wrestling in the sense that it shows that there are other companies that can be drawing lots of people outside of WWE. Even though AEW has its fair shares of issues, ups and downs, really. But Hulk Hogan was definitely the second biggest contribution to professional wrestling. Vince McMahon is number one. And when we think about Hulk Hogan, there's a lot of things that he's done. That, first of all, in the 1980s, he did a few major things. Like, I'll say in the 1970s and 80s, he still was working on his craft. So he's one of those wrestlers that went over to Japan and got better. And that happens with a lot of professional wrestlers where they learn that their career path in WWE or WWF needs more fine tuning, so they'll go to other promotions and become bigger and better. A great example is AJ Styles, because I believe the story with AJ Styles was that after he went to TNA, Vince McMahon talked to him and said, okay, we're interested in you, but we want you to go to Japan for a while and see if you can be a big star there, really. So Hogan kind of started that trend of people going to Japan to become bigger and better stars and then coming back to the US. And another, example of that is Big Von Vader and other wrestlers. So he started that trend of, if you wrestle in other companies, you can find that one company that can help you out. Another great example is Stone Cold. He went to WCW and he learned some skills. He went to ECW for a while and then he went to WWE. So, sometimes going to other companies to get bigger and better and then coming back will make you good. Another thing about Hogan was that he really started I would say what would I say a cultural zeitgeist wrestler. I'm not a zeitgeist wrestler. A zeitgeist wrestler means you take what's ever popular in culture and you make that into a professional wrestler persona. Like during the 1980s and 70s, Rocky was a very famous film. So when you had Hulk Hogan, he kind of took like Rocky and he became that all American really. And this is also during the time of the Cold War. So American patriotism, defeating the Soviets, like how he defeated Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik and a lot of these foreign wrestlers, Andre the Giant, the Frenchman. Hogan kind of was that wrestler that he was about the cultural zeitgeist, and then also the saying your prayers, eating your vitamins. There's Reagan talking about eating healthy, saying no to drugs, public PSAs. So he kind of like Hogan took that. So then you kind of see some inspirations of that. Stone Cold Steve Austin was kind of like a poor redneck drinker, and when you look at the Jerry Springer show, you see a lot of people who behave like Stone Cold Steve Austin, like white trash, really. When you look at John Cena, he's another example of that. Like in the early 2000s, after September 11th, the Marines were very popular. Eminem was popular, the Wigger culture, and John Cena took those things and became a star after that. And even when you look at nowadays, you have Cody Rhodes, and Roman Reigns, and they're nepo babies, meaning that nowadays nepotism and get you places really. So they're kind of both like nepo baby wrestlers. Or you throw in Dominic Mysterio, but Hogan kind of said, okay, that's all the zeitgeist really. Like the '80s was, the was nationalism. The 1990s was trash TV with Austin. The 2000s was nationalism, supporting the military, and then also the Wigger culture. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, in the 2020s, it was definitely a culture of how should I say this? A culture of nepotism, nepo babies, and then also with Hogan, he was like the first megastar wrestler. Like a lot of people would say Ric Flair or the Von Erichs. No, it was Hogan because the television era was a new form of media, really. So definitely, being on television networks, instead of being like, a wrestling territory, he was all over the U.S. on television, then he was all over internationally, and he was really that wrestler that was like the first like mega star, And when they even did like in WWE, they had him do mega star things. Like they had him and Mr. T and a lot of celebrities get at WrestleMania really to make WWE more mainstream. And then you also did something with Hogan where you had him. I'm trying to think. You had him like in addition to like wrestling like celebrities and bring celebrities into WWE, you had him like I think it's like the Silverdome or the Pontiac Superdome or Silverdome. That drew like I forgot how many people, like over 60,000, maybe 70,000 people. So that was kind of almost like the large professional wrestling event, for a while really, and Hogan and Andre really drew that crowd really. So he was kind of a great example of that wrestler that was like the first one to kind of draw those really really big crowds really. And then you kind of see AEW, you know, like 30 years later with MJF and Adam Cole in the main event, or you see like John Cena in the main event in many WrestleManias, or Cody Rhodes or Roman Reigns, or like WrestleMania drawing like 70,000 people and other things like that. So a lot of that started with Hogan, like saying that wrestling could be a big deal. And then also, people do traditions. So there's people who go to like wrestling events every single year, and then their kids are going to do that. So it kind of really started franchising professional wrestling. So he had great contributions in that. The other thing about Hogan is that him leaving WWF was a great move because it showed that you don't always need the WWF vehicle to be a successful wrestler. You look at Hogan, and when he went to WCW, he was successful there with the NWO. You look at Sting and how he left WCW, and he had a great run in TNA wrestling. You look at people like Swerve Strickland, who, left WWE, and then now he has a successful run in AEW. You look at somebody like MJF, who was in WWE and NXT, just did a cameo, and now he's successful in AEW, really. So he really started that trend of, okay, you don't need the WWE machine, really, to be successful. Or you look at something like AJ Styles. He was in WCW, and I believe he was in WWE. Those things didn't work out, so he went to TNA Wrestling. So it showed that you don't need the WWE machine to be successful, really. The next thing about Hogan that's helpful is that of his heel turn, because he did have the greatest heel turn in professional wrestling history, just turning into the NWO, really. And then also, it did inspire a lot of just, heel turns that drew a lot of money. I think one example, and I know that this didn't draw a lot of money, no disrespect, was AJ Styles in TNA Wrestling. Like, he was really like, the company guy, then became that tweener. You don't know if he's good or bad, really. And then he took that and he went to Japan with that. Then he took that and he went to WWE with that. You also look at other wrestlers, Shawn Michaels turning heel on a couple of times, or The Rock and Austin turning babyface and heel. So a lot of that started with Hogan in WCW. And then also the other thing too is that you look at many professional wrestlers who got in the industry or benefited from Hogan. Bruce Barber Beefcake was his cousin. I think they said something like, if I'm correct, Mike Awesome was one of his relatives, if I'm correct. The other thing about it is that you look at people who worked with him, like The Big Show, The Undertaker, The Rock, and you look at people like Eugene, who did a segment with Hogan, and other things like that. So he did help out a lot of people. And you even look at AJ Styles, even though I've criticized Hogan for destroying TNA Wrestling, really that got AJ Styles to get out of there and then see a bigger world outside TNA Wrestling. So that was kind of a byproduct of Hogan, really. There are a bunch of bad things that he did. I like the wrestling union. That's probably the worst thing he did. He reported Jesse the Body Ventura because he was close with Vince. he ruined TNA wrestling. He and Bischoff, fucked that up really. There's the racist comments, and like I've said before, using the N word and just not apologizing. That's a really really big deal. But it's not like it's not like he shot a black kid on his property. It's still a big deal, but there's been worse. There's been worse people doing worse racist stuff, really, but it's still a big deal. Um, Also, I would say that there was a story recently that I think that Brooke Hogan gave birth. She almost died giving birth, and I'm not sure why, but they said like Hogan didn't want to be there and he didn't even want to see the grandchild or whatever because he had some issues with Brooke or he didn't like who she married. So there's elements of Hulk Hogan that he was an asshole. He was a compulsive liar, and even like even like with TNA wrestling, I'm not sure how much booking power that he had, but the last segment with Hogan was Dixie Carter hugging his leg, which embarrassed the company. And then the other thing that he did was he did a spoof with the Miley Cyrus wrecking ball thing. So it's almost like once again it was just like he never really he got a lot of money from TNA wrestling, but he never really cared about that company. And then the other thing about it is that, as people said, that when you saw him on American Idol and other programming, he would not wear a TNA Impact shirt to promote the company. So Hogan was definitely, a person that was very, very selfish. Or even like when you see footage in WCW of Vader like throwing him or doing a military press, Hogan gets up in like 2 seconds really. And then there was that thing where Macho Man wins the WCW title and Hogan's like running around and being like, hey, you know what? It's me. Look at me celebrating Macho Man. So there has been a lot of times in Hogan's career where he threw people under the bus, and he only cared about himself really. Like he was definitely, in one regards, he was a sociopath. But what a lot of people have to understand, and what you may not understand, is that when you're in the film business, because I've done filmmaking, when you are in entertainment, you really have to care about yourself. You really have to be a sociopath. That's because there's a lot of people like that, and unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast, really. I think that Hogan kind of understood that. He probably learned from Vince and other people that in the end of the day, it's about you. And ultimately, you got to stay on top as much as you can, really. Because, like, once people move on from you, that's that. Like, a great example is the Fabulous Moolah. Like, one of the reasons why she was so successful, or she was a champion for, like, almost 40 years, and one of the reasons why there will never be a title reign long as Moolah's, nobody's going to be a 40-year champion. One of the reasons why Moolah was on top so long is because she learned from from all the bookers. You gotta raise your friends and put other people down. You gotta put the next in line down, really, and that's very unfortunate. But that's just how people maintain power, really. Like I've done filmmaking, and I've definitely experienced that where people didn't want to see me be successful. People got in my head. People pushed my buttons, so I would self-sabotage. And it's like saying, oh, well, you know what, it's friendly fire, because in the end of the day, it's about other people burying me to make themselves successful, really. So Hogan was definitely in that industry, and that's kind of why he did that, So definitely that industry makes you a sociopath. The other thing that I want to say about Hogan, and I think that we all have to think about, is that his death really is something to think about, because there are times in our lives when we do good things and bad things, and sometimes, when people die, we have to look at the full picture, and sometimes it's not really a simple answer as, let's just praise every good thing they do, and it's not a simple answer as, like, to hell with them or fuck them or whatever, really. You have to look at the full picture, but I think overall, if you really was to look at the impact he had on the world, he has had a monstrously positive effect, really. Like, he's the reason why professional wrestling is a multi-billion-dollar industry. He's the reason why, a lot of wrestlers make over $100,000 a year or more. He's the reason why, there are wrestlers who make millions of dollars and tens of millions of dollars. He's the reason why, like, a lot of us are not sitting home jerking off. We're actually, just going to wrestling events and all that stuff. There's a reason why people cite, like, What Culture, Simon Miller, JD from New York, Brian Zane, and a few other people are making money with wrestling because of Hulk Hogan, because he made that industry so big. So even though, there are some very bad aspects of him, it's important to recognize he's had a lot more positive than negative. I also want to talk about a personal story that, and this is kind of like, relates to Hulk Hogan. and what we have to think about. Like when I was in college, I always worked very very hard, and I remember like there was one year where I was working 20-hour days, and I was kind of like working a lot of hours because I wanted to get put a good into the college really. And I remember like how after that summer where I was working 20-hour days, um, that I graduated like 2 years later, and I remember like during my graduation nobody applauded me, like everybody wanted to disrespect me, and that was for a couple of reasons. That the thing was that I was very antisocial. The other reason was that I was going through a lot of PTSD, so I remember making like art about a lot of like my tough feelings, my issues with racism that I dealt with, issues with domestic violence that I dealt with, issues with my ex girlfriend who was lying about being abused and other things like that. And I remember like in a sense I felt like like Hulk Hogan in a way, where I felt like what, here I worked 20-hour weeks. Um, I worked all hours that I could because I wanted to make the college a better place. I had professors call me a nigger. I had students call me a nigger. Um, I've had professors say things like I don't deserve to graduate with how I write. Like I really took a lot of disrespect, but I kept on going. I kept on doing the right thing. And I also remember like my art exhibition where where the art curator said that was my senior exhibition. After it was taken down, they took all my plywood paintings, they just sawed it, and they made a clubhouse out of it. So paintings that are supposed to represent my heart and soul and all my pain and emotions. There's a bunch of kids running around with muddy shoes on those pieces of plywood, really. And instead of like their original idea where they wanted to hang that, and I remember like feeling very disheartened and hurt, and I remember like saying some things too, like what, like I want something bad to happen at this college, really, because of all the disrespect that I got. But it's very similar to Hogan and how some people look at him. Where some people would trash his legacy. Some people will be like, okay, you did all these great things, but fuck him, really. The same way I was in college, I did all these great things. I worked very hard, and some people are like, fuck him, or when they took my abstract paintings and they just got a table saw and they just sawed it off and made it like floorboards for a clubhouse. Um, that's kind of a big fuck you to me, and that happens in our lives. And sometimes we have to think about that. Sometimes, even if people are controversial, we got to think about their contributions. And sometimes it's very hurtful to be an asshole to somebody who's actually given a lot. And there are times in our life too where there are some people who have mixed, um, really have polarizing view. And sometimes people praise everything that they do, or there's a huge like side of people praising them, like Hulk Hogan, and then there are other sides where people do nothing but bash them. Like honestly, Moolah, um, Fabulous Moolah, like even though she did a lot of horrible things, she she broke open a lot of doors for women's wrestling, and then her being a champion for that long, that is an accomplishment. But people don't talk about that. People focus more on what she did wrong. Or Chris Benoit was another person. He was a significant wrestler because he proved that small wrestlers like Bryan Danielson should be champions. He really opened that door, but nobody talks about it because of what he did really. So there are times when there are people who are polarizing, and people focus only on the bad. People only focus on the good. People just forget their contributions. Just like when I was in college, people forgot about my contributions and treated me like a nigger because I did go to school in Vermont, Vermont University, Johnson State College, and that was just how they treated African Americans, and it was unfortunate, but also I think the other lesson too is that we always have to think about our choices. We have to think about our lives and the impact that we have really. So there are people like me who struggle with antisocial issues, like my mental health issues that I develop antisocial tendencies from traumatic experiences and sometimes schizophrenia and other like mental health issues. But I've learned that no matter what I've been through, I got to be a good person. So when you are trying to make good in the world, when you are trying to be remembered for something, just understand that people are going to remember both the good and the bad that you do. So it makes sense to just do the best that you can, be good to others, atone, repent, take accountability, And also, don't be so bitter, like how Hogan was bitter to his daughter right before he died, really, because when we die, the only thing that's remembered about us is our legacy, and then there's a memory of us. So learn from Hogan to be a better person, but also understand that even if you change the world and more than you can ever imagine, maybe in infinite ways like Hogan did, just remember you should always aim to be a better person. And then also, when people die, look at the full picture, really, and let's be honest with ourselves about the person that died, really. And we all can be honest that Hulk Hogan has had infinitely positive impacts on this world and professional wrestling. Like, honestly, it is an industry, and there's a reason why, there's thousands of wrestlers making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So if you were to, like, say, if he had a more of a positive or negative impact, his positives outweigh the negatives. Even though there are some despicable things that he did that I think everybody can learn from if they want to have a professional wrestling career or any type of like public figure career. So definitely a mixed person. I don't hold him in a high regard. Just because I just didn't like the things that he did, especially ruining TNA Wrestling when that could have been a major company. And he hurt a lot of people, really. There was a lot of people that could have been bigger and better, really. So I still don't have a high opinion of Hulk Hogan, but I think it's important just to look at the full picture and acknowledge the full picture of him.